So I want to welcome everybody to our new series. It's a three-part series, Renewing Parish Life, and today dealing with pluralism and dissent. Then next week, I hope everyone's going to spread the word, and a lot of people will come as we, the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday next week, and we'll be talking about preparing for Lent, the Lenten liturgies, and so on. So that's usually one of the more popular things we do, so I hope people will come to participate in that. Talking, some handouts there. Right there. An overhead we do, right there.
Check if it works. It does.
Very good. Am I supposed to use it for something now?
Well, then you are.
Checking it. Okay. Handouts right there on the way up. We're still getting all this.
We're still getting
Theory in dealing with renewing parish life and dealing with the question of pluralism tonight and dissent in the church, and next week talking about preparing for Lenten liturgies and then continuing Christian formation. So I want to begin by thinking a little bit about that problem of pluralism and the fact that we have many different outlooks and viewpoints in the church today. In fact, it's so bewildering, it's hard to get hold of it all. We know historically we've always had differences of opinion. Do you remember in the first chapter of Corinthians already, Paul talked about these different groups. They had followers of Apollos and Paul and Cephas, and a group that followed Christ, as they said. And he says, well, what are we doing with all these different groups in the church? Why are we all scattered and divided like this? We ought to be united. So right away in the church we see in the earliest days we had divisions. You had Paul confronting Paul to his face in Galatians, where he says to Peter, well, you've sold out to another party here. You've let the group that is in favor of every having to be all the men circumcised, you've sold out to them, and now you eat with the Jewish converts. Paul had to look into his face. So we've had pluralism all the way over the line. It seems, though, within our own time, that has become conscious of us. We have seen it in different ways. Visions seem to be sharper. It's harder to get people to get along with Parish. If all the viewpoints, attitudes, and unfortunately all leads to polarization or to strife. We end up with dissent. We end up with people trying to figure out are in or out of this community that we call church. And so we have this sort of bewildering array of different outlooks in the church. A lot of authors have tried to make sense out of it. Try to say, well, how would you look at all this group? How would you categorize people and to figure out who and what they hold and so on? So just to do what some of the approaches to this, trying to make sense out of vision. Of course, we have the sort of obvious ones. We got progressives and we got conservatives. There's some people who want to turn back, get back to Vatican II like it used to be, and then other people who want more change in the church. That's sort of obvious. We have also the sort of pictures according to mindsets that I often talk about. I want to add to that. I often talk about this between classical mindset and contemporary mindsets. Classical mindset sees the world in sort of static terms, see truth as timeless. They see reality often as black and white. Or world for them is structured and ordered. The thing to do in life is figure out where you fit and make that work for yourself. Then other people with what we contemporary mindset altogether different. They have a moving viewpoint. They see the world in dynamic terms. They're always saying, look, if you look at it this way, you could say, well, it's good to have girl servers. But look at it this way, maybe it wouldn't work. But they always say there's different perspectives. It depends on how you come at the question as to what you see, how you frame the question. It's true like the abortion debate. One of the best lectures we had in our Murray lecture thing was Brian Hare. Here it says, when you look at the whole abortion debate, the question, the first thing is how do you frame the question? If you frame the question in terms of women's right to their body, be the government going to tell them what to do, well, there's no doubt where American people are down on that kind of question. I mean, very clear that, being in favor of individual rights. So if you frame the question that way, I mean, there's no choice side in the American culture. However, if you frame the question another way, say, well, it's a matter of balancing the rights of the woman involved, the pregnant woman, and of the husband, and of the fetus. You begin to frame the question in a way, and the answer seems to come out. At least begin to look different as you stop the equation. So the contemporary people understand that. Now, I want to add a third category to the mindsets that we have available today, and what many people call today postmodern mindset. There's a lot of literature out on postmodernity. What that means is that there are people around today who say, well, the modern world created by the Enlightenment. We say Enlightenment, we're talking about the historical period, the 18th century, when it's really at height, I suppose. And the idea is that we got to get rid of religion as an authoritarian system. What we have to do is free up people to think for themselves, to use their reason. They'll develop science, that'll solve our problem, and then have a democratic spirit. And we will have equality, all the things French Revolution for, and so on. That's sort of the whole package that people call modernity. It is a set of reason to celebrate human beings. The institutions aren't restricting us too much. There are the things to be careful of, rid of, and various, get rid of the authoritarianism in the world. So here we have modernity. And, as some authors say, what happened is the church taught modernity 150 years. The syllabus in the 18th century, which Pope Pius said, we're against this modern world. We're against democracy. Can't have democracy. That won't work. We're against freedom of the press or freedom of speech and all that. Just gets you in trouble. So the church for 150 years fought against modernity. And it said, not right. It's, going to take us down the wrong path and so on. And finally, in the 1960s, the church said modernity. That's what the meaning of the Second Vatican Council said. Well, that hasn't right. We can celebrate freedom. There's more freedom now. We were said for now the modern world, before the democratic processes in society and so on. So the Second Vatican Council was saying yes to modernity. Well, then the postmodern people see it this way. They say, well, Greeley's Law was in effect once more. As soon as the culture began to see there was something wrong with modernity, is exactly the time when the church embraced it. Greeley's Law is that we always embrace something exactly at the time when other people in the secular world see that it doesn't work anymore. That usually goes with whether we're adopting business structures to the church or the latest management theory, or it doesn't seem to matter what it is that we adopt. It's soon out of date, and we're sitting there figuring out what to do about it. Well, anyway, the postmodern people say we were too optimistic about this world, that Gaudium et Spes, the great pastoral constitution of the Second Vatican Council, was off the track by too embracing the world too much. It talked about the goodness of the world too much, right, when we're all figuring out the world's pretty screwed up. It's a mess, so why are we embracing it this way? We need to be more countercultural, more judgmental, critical of it. So we have a whole school of thought now that thinks of themselves as postmodern and says we have to rethink all of this. Some of the postmodern people, are those who are liberationists, who say, you look at the real world, it's filled with oppression. What you really got to do is get rid of, fight the oppression in the world. Can't just baptize the culture. Some people say, well, if you just accept freedom uncritically like this, it leads to irresponsibility. Well, if you just accept these developments, then we don't have a critical role anymore. Same thing, modernity was extremely sexist. The modern world celebrated males and their accomplishments, had very little to say about women's experience. So postmodern people say have to bring in the women's experience more. So when we begin to look at our church today, that's one of the categories that I think is helpful. It has to do with fundamental mindsets. How do we view the world? Are we negative towards the world? Do we embrace the world? Or do we take sort of a critical attitude towards the world? Another set of categories that I think are really helpful in terms of where people are at, and that's Eugene Kennedy, who I'm afraid aren't very helpful, but the idea is he distinguished culture one Catholics from culture two Catholics. Culture one Catholics take the institution seriously, probably like a lot of people here in this room. I mean, we see a lot of us care about what happens in the church. Care about whether it's going to improve itself, whether the Pope's going to make good decisions, what the bishops are saying, what the pastoral letter said, how we're structuring ourselves in the diocese. I mean, there's care. A lot of us, work within that church structure and so on. So in Kennedy's things, we're culture one Catholics. But then he also points out there's culture two Catholics who are Catholic. They call them that. They go to Mass pretty early, and they draw on the tradition, and they learn the meditation and pray what the tradition says, all kind of things. But psychologically independent of the structures. They really don't lose any sleep over what the Pope said, or they don't really care what the bishops say in pastoral letters. They happen to like it, and then they fine, we'll latch on to that. So they just are psychologically independent of the church. They don't care about it. I mean, I know a lot of people like that. I mean, they don't know why some of the rest of us waste our time worrying about it. It's sort of like, well, the waste of time isn't any good. You get on with life and do what it is that you might do with yourself. So we got two. That distinct thing says a lot about why some are interested in certain things. People don't seem to care. Another set of distinctions that comes from an author by the name of Van Beek. I think I mentioned his book here, A Catholic Identity After Vatican II. This is somewhat similar. He talks about the people who are very comfortable with the institutional church, take it very seriously. No sense of saying the words that he uses for this, but that's one type he sees. Then he sees the charismatics. Charismatics are more into the gifts of the Spirit and going their own way with those gifts. And then the mystics, who, as he says, are really more concerned about their personal relationship with Christ, and that's the thing that really moves them and makes them function and so on. Now let me try another one in terms of what people read. And for some people this makes sense, for others they're not into it. But you can take the favorite magazines of Catholics and come up with a whole profile, I suppose, of what, how we might understand these distinctions. So first we have the wanderer Catholics. And these are the arch conservatives. I mean, you read Wanderer, it's attacking all those people we have coming here to lecture in the spring quarter. I mean, those are the bad people. Richard McBrien, he would be a favorite whipping boy. Or, strangely enough, Raymond Brown, who's our finest scripture scholar and a very moderate teacher. For some reason, they've latched onto him too, and they don't like him especially. So the Wanderer people, I mean, they're just against all this stuff. They often attack the scholars and so on, against the contemporary developments, want to go back before Vatican II. Then, secondly, there's one called the Crisis Catholics. That's the magazine founded by Michael Novak. It has a neoconservative line. Their great heroes are George Weigel, who we had lecturing here, and Richard Newhouse, the Lutheran pastor who became a Catholic. That's their line of thought. They're called the neoconservatives. They're great theologians, Hans Urs von Balthasar. And it's an interesting thing. I personally read Crisis Magazine regularly. I find it very helpful, very enlightening. A lot of the material is just very different from what the usual liberal line is, and very often they're talking about religion and culture, and I find a lot of good cultural analyses in there. I like to use their material a lot. Then we have the America Catholics, and I guess these are the more moderate people. I read the Jesuit magazine America, and they're great theologians. I think for them is Avery Dulles. So the theologians we got coming here in the spring, Avery Dulles probably stands right in the middle there someplace, between Michael Novak over on the right and Richard McBrien on the left. Dulles is the example of the America. He has a lot of articles in America, and always very balanced. It includes a clerical perspective and so on. Then we have the Commonweal Catholics, the liberal thing, the lay people's sort of Catholic journal, and the great theologian for them, I would say, is Karl Rahner, and the one who talks about life in the world, lay involvement in the world, and so on. Then we have the NCR Catholics. the paper that I used to write for, and always had a lot of trouble with their editors there and so on. That was a stormy history in my own writing career. I think I did that about 5 years. And I think of the NCR as more liberationist. That is, they've taken this clear stand of interest in Latin America. Rosemary Ruther still writes for them. She's very popular in that paper and so on. Very aware of institutional evil, social sin, need for structural change. Then finally there would be the New Covenant, the magazine of the Charismatics, emphasis on the Holy Spirit. So you can sort of look around the average parish among Catholics and say, well, which magazines do they read? And sort of a profile comes out. A way of understanding these differences that we indeed have to deal with. Now, I want to look at some of the, just briefly recall to our mind the issues that have made an impact on us in the recent years, and then to take up the more current issues. So we've all gone through the Curran case. Charles Curran dismissed from his post. Someone was very upset about that. I had a priest friend of mine who read one of my Reflections articles on that and wrote me, he says, I just can't understand how you can support Charles Curran. It doesn't make any sense. I used to live in the Josephyte house in New York, and this priest there lived in the house. We were very good friends, but I mean, boy, I read that stuff, he just made him mad when I wrote about Curran and supporting him and his fight with Cardinal Ratzinger over the sexual questions he wrote about, whether he could teach at CU or not. You got the Hans Kung case, Kung being not allowed to teach at Tübingen to the seminarians and so on, a lot of publicity around that. Archbishop of Funhausen, celebrated case out in Seattle, Christians of birth control, married priests, ordaining women. We've been into these issues for a long time. Look at it at the parish level, we see people disagreeing whether we should have confession before communion. We had a terrible thing in our own diocese that way. It really, sort of epitomized the kind of splits that we see. So we had a policy that seemed to make sense to people in the United States. Why have little kids go to confession before communion? Because they're hardly thinking that 7 years old are running around committing mortal sins. They got to get them into confession before they go to communion. There's a lot of people in the pastoral who say, well, that doesn't make sense. Move that later on. Let them go to confession later when they get older, 4th or 5th, 6th grade. Don't link it with communion because it's not essentially linked anyway. It gives them bad ideas. So we had that sort of policy. Well, then what happens? Well, there's some of those wanderer readers who say we don't like that, and they begin to complain. So they complain to the Vatican. And they write letters right there to the big brass in the Vatican. They have their people they know who to write to. When I get sort of mildly critical mail from them, it's always a copy to these cardinals in Rome and to all these bigwigs. So, the word goes over there. Well, they don't do that right in Toledo. That priest on the radio in Toledo, that guy says things that aren't true doctrine. So then they get pressure. Then what happens in the Vatican, they listen to this because the right wing of the United States is very powerful over there. Right wing has a lot of money very often in the United States. I guess that's how it usually sorts out, doesn't it? Politically and so on. So these people, and they get a hearing. Then the word comes back from the Vatican, what are you doing there? You're not supposed to have confession later on. You're supposed to have it before communion. And so then pressure is put on, and our bishop has to revise the policy and then go back the other way, which most people in the United States don't make sense. We got problems. Now we got problems for the clergy. Because they got a lot of clergy, pastors who are sitting there saying, well, why should I do that? Why should I do that? Because I know it's better for these kids to do it the other way. We educate the parents, and I don't want to do it that way. Now we got a real problem on our hands. What do we do? Well, this is the way it actually plays itself out in parishes now, diocesan life and so on. That's life in the 20th century church. And it's a power game. It's hardball, as they say. It's a tough political battle, and it's very often hard to know what to do about all that. And if one would try to mediate those disputes, it gets very tricky. Like, what would you say? How would you work out compromise on things of first confession beforehand? And that's very hard. There's a lot of hours to figure out how you compromise that. That's the kind of thing that we're going on, and difficult kind of questions. We got questions about control that some will have. We got the question of physical adaptations, whether they're working or not. An interesting distinction. There's a voice, and I play this off with some other theologians in the country, liturgy and so on. I really have not been able to make the point clear, but I am in dialogue with some people who don't like the way the liturgy is going. Now, I don't mean the reactionaries, the wanderer types who don't like anything like that. I'm talking about intelligent, with it people who have maybe concern for social justice and like Vatican II, and they're all for what's going on generally in liberal circles, but they don't like something about the liturgy. There's something wrong with the way we've reformed the liturgy. And as I say, I've had a lot of dialogue with these people, and it's hard for me to put it exactly into words. I'll tell you how one person tried to tell it to me. He said, what worked for me liturgically is when I had a strong sense of the mystery of God, the infinite God, and I'm going into church on Sunday now, and I've got this feeling God's vast and powerful, and everything about the liturgy that would make me feel that mystery, feel this greatness of God, the infinite character of God, whether it was type of singing you had, or the Gothic architecture, or Gregorian chant, or whatever made you feel like that. He said the power of the liturgy for me was then to have that feeling and then to go to communion. When it all got focused, when somehow the great, vast, infinite God was now present for me in very clear, tangible, finite way that, sort of blows me away. Now, that's about the best I can do with explaining what this other feeling is. There is a growing sense of that. And as I'm saying all that, I realize I'm lecturing on this topic next week. I'm churchy and so on. I must have printed that. But anyway. But it's different, that thing needs to be taken seriously. In my effort to communicate that to the theologians in the mill, I can't seem to make that point, but I have a lot of people that have a feeling something like that. There's something wrong with what we're doing in liturgy. We have to straighten out if we're going to do better. Okay. Now, some of the more recent issues. I mean, just combing through some of the periodicals, we say, what is the divisive points now? Some of you might have seen Richard McBrien, and this is a recent NCR, February 21st. He says we're only 3 months away from a disaster. People read this, it's 3 months away from a disaster. What is it? Wow, I'm starting to read. What's this ecclesiastical disaster that's going to happen? Didn't know about this. Well, what's going to happen is, in 3 months, we might get the beatification of the founder of Opus Dei. Now, that probably doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but Opus Dei is a group founded in 1976, very conservative in orientation, sort of secret about what they do. Pope John Paul II seems to love them and think they're the most terrific people around. Many of the bishops fear them. Campus ministers around the country, really got trouble with them when they're near campuses. And they see them very often trying to recruit these students sort of silently. They'll talk about it, they're brainwashing these students into very conservative ways of thinking. And often they have sort of an appeal for people who seem to be financially well off. They seem to have an eye for finding people who would like to sort of keep the status quo, political reactionary types and so on, often tied to that. Well, see, Richard McBrien says we're in real danger here. He indicates in his column, indirectly at least, that this fellow, Escriva, is not a very nice fellow at all, that he was arrogant and all this, that he hated Vatican II, wanted to turn the clock back. So he says, if we get this beatification of this guy in 3 months from now, then we're really going to have another divisive element at work in the church. This is going to hurt us in one way or another. Probably it's sort of putting the stamp of approval on Opus Dei and giving them a free run, then their founders are beatified, moving towards sainthood, and give them far more power than they currently have in the church. And I know that there's a lot of campus ministers and so on who would be very fearful of that happening. It would make it difficult for them to minister where Opus Dei has decided to try to challenge the bishop's campus ministry program there. Well, another news item that strikes me along this line, that is the Matthew Fox story continues. You remember he was silenced for a year and so on. Now the latest is that his order, the head of the Dominican order in Chicago, has ordered him to come from out on the West Coast where he has his Creation Spirituality Institute and to come back to Chicago. Now we got a power play within the order itself, not from the Vatican. And now we've got Matthew Fox says he's not going back to Chicago. And his latest move is to try to affiliate with the Dutch Dominicans so that he can have greater freedom. So we have an ongoing dispute in that way. Another dispute that, strikes me as is the dispute between Michael Novak and Eugene Kennedy over whether the wisdom of the bishops, what the bishops did was for their pro-life movement was to hire a consulting firm, right, and pay him, $3 million to get our pro-life message out. Well, Eugene Kennedy, former priest from Chicago, has been just against that. He says, you don't do that. He says, we stand for truth. Public relations people stand for image. Well, it's like it's wrong from the word go. You shouldn't be doing this. Let's not sell ourselves out here and, give ourselves over to these people. We don't want to make our points through this kind of method. It says they paper over real life. The church's message is there's a tragic character to life. There's the cross, there's sorrow, and these kind of people don't have a sense of that. On the other hand, Michael Novak, being in the business world and the American Enterprise Institute, neoconservatives, they seem to like it. That's what you should do. Business people to tell you to do in the church. So you can see, I mean, like that, this Knights of Columbus funded it for $3 million. Now the bishops have backed out of it. They severed the relationship. They weren't happy, weren't happy with the job. Didn't do much. The bishops saw that. Well, I guess I could go on forever with this pluralism thing. Another article in NCI caught my mind was it was supposed malaise in the Church of Chicago. Now, many of us look at Chicago as being the great renewed center. Now we got Cardinal Bernardine there. Many of us think he's, the most skilled political bishop, has liberal leanings at least, and knows how to get things done. Now we got a big article in NCR by Robert McClory saying there's a malaise in the church in Chicago. And you got the people in the parishes. The people actually working in the parishes think that the diocesan offices with Cardinal Bernardine are out of touch. They don't know what's going on. Andy Greeley's come into it now. Andy says who's reconciled with Cardinal Bernardine now. They've been at odds for a long time. Andy is back with him now, and Andy says he gets bad information. That bureaucratic structure there in the diocese doesn't let them know what's really going on in the parish. And here we see an echo of things that we hear around the country generally. So we get little disputes here between just people that function at the diocesan level and people functioning at the parish level. Well, a lot of these disputes go on here. Does anyone want to ask me anything about that sort of profile of the current state of pluralism in the Catholic Church today? Yes? Yeah, I didn't say anything about that, did I? The polarities that creates. Yeah. Well, I think that the first thing is sort of a reading of the option of the poor for the, taken from Latin America, which is really, we're going to identify with the poor, we're going to be on their side, we're really going to bend over backwards to see what we can do with the poor. That's where the action is. They're the prophetic movement in the world. Church is going to be with them. We get Oscar Romero, all of that. We try to bring that into the United States context, and then the bishops write the economics pastoral, and they're trying to work in this option for the poor, and you got all the middle-class Catholics, not unlike the political campaign right now. All the middle-class Catholics are saying, well, wait a second. We struggled to make it. Our grandparents fought and struggled, and we worked hard to put our kids through college, and we're making it now, and that's overblown. What is this option for the poor? How about an option for middle-class people? And so that became part of the dynamics that went into the writing of the pastoral letter. And so as soon as you say that, it's like a flag word. I mean, the neoconservatives, option for the poor is not a happy word for them. What is this option for the poor? You need an option for creativity, as Novak says. You need an option for democratic capitalism. Got to spread create more wealth. And then you'll get, the famous trickle-down approach that we heard from the Reagan administration, that this is now going to help those poor people. But this pure identification with the poor and raising them up is not the way we ought to go. So, that's the polarized opinion on the thing, it seems to me. You have the people who are like, Dorothy Day, who are in empathy with the poor, they live with the poor, they care for them, Catholic worker houses, and that's where the action is. That's putting on the mind of Christ. That's Christ had a special care for the poor. There's a canon that we use from Edward Skillebeck that says, it says something like this. I don't know if I get the words exactly right, but we're praising Christ who had a special care for the poor, but without ever forgetting the others. So somehow it seems as though we're trying to work out a schema here so that middle-class people, or well-to-do people for that matter, are not left out of this picture. And I think the bishops tried to do that in the economic pastoral, try to make sure the middle class felt as though their concerns were cared for. So I say that gets played out now in the campaign, and democratic insistence of reaching to the middle class and so on. Yes?
Aren't lining up with the conditions and the wealth, so they're claiming that basically forced out, or take a stand or forced out.
That's right. You have many of the conservatives. That would be sort of the wanderer line, or the very conservative line, that if you won't accept all of the doctrines, won't accept the clear moral teaching, that you ought to get out, and that the bishops ought to set it up so they kick them out if they don't toe the line. And I would say that the neoconservatives like Michael Novak don't really want Richard McBride to leave the church. That's not their line. You got to move further to the right before you're going to get that viewpoint. You're going to get it in the Wanderer or what I'd call the reactionaries and so on. And that's what you got with Archbishop Lefebvre and his traditionalist movement and so on. Get with the program or else you're out. And that really, is one of the great problems overall in this whole polarization thing, the pluralism leading to polarization, is that the other is then seen as the enemy, the bad person. And then that's when we really got problems in the church. You have the opposite viewpoint of someone like Charles Kern, who keeps walking around saying it's a big church. What is James Joyce's line? What does it mean to be a Catholic? You say, here comes everybody. You're going to welcome everybody. Here comes everybody. So you got two different viewpoints on that. But you're right. Some want to say you're out if you don't see it our way. That's when the pluralism becomes polarization, and we end up with the real difficulty. The polarization occurs, it seems like, when the groups that are there no longer feel like they're working together for the good of the whole church. Now they're enemies. They're in opposition to one another. They have a need to fight one another. They don't think they can learn from one another. Now we've got polarization. I must say that becomes more of a problem for conservatives than liberals. Liberals, by very dint of their position, are able to be more embracing about it. I mean, I really don't even want the reactionaries to get out of the church. I mean, they're part of it also. I may disagree strongly with their viewpoints on many things, but I really don't want to kick them out, nor do I think they're out. On the other hand, the wanderer people want to take the liberals and say they're out. They're no good. They're not authentic Catholics, they're not Orthodox. So they put themselves out, and the bishops are just too weak-kneed to really see that and act on it. So the polarization, maybe it's just my own liberal bias, but when it moves in that direction, I see the problem more from the conservative side. That they're less open to the idea of us living in some sort of mutual harmony with one another. I think that to move to the next section of what I wanted to say, why don't I try to go for a while here, and then we'll take a break around 8:30 and reassess what's happening here. Anyway, there's a number of theological points that I think need to be kept in mind when you begin to think what is going on here. And the first thing is that pluralism is absolutely inevitable, and it is, in the long run, to be celebrated as a good. In other words, any idea of trying to get this Catholic community and get it back to uniformity misses essential things about us, about life, and about God. The truth of the matter is that we human beings have limited intellectual capacity. We have limited ability to respond to the call of God. And as soon as we say it's limited, that means all of us are limited in various ways. Just by the fact of human nature, the limited character of our ability to comprehend what the world's about, what Christianity is about, what Jesus is about, means that you and me and even wanderer readers only see part of the reality at any point. And not only that, do we only see part of the reality of Christ and God and the church, but we're only able to articulate tiny parts of it. We can never say it, conceptualize it, get it into words so we can say, now here's a sentence or a comprehensive statement of Christ that we can all for sure hang on to and believe and hold and so on. It's impossible. So that's why we understand that you got pluralism as soon as you got any important topic. You got different viewpoints of what we're going to do about housing in our country. Not everyone thinks the same because it's a tough, complex issue and because human beings attacking the problem got limited mentality. But the problem in the church circles or the religious matter gets worse and is heightened because the reality we're dealing with is God. The gracious mystery, the absolutely incomprehensible, inexhaustible one. And so for sure, nobody can walk around and say, hey, I know what we all got to believe about this and how you say it. It's impossible. You can't control God like that. God's too big. So the first thing that we have to see about all of this is that the pluralism is just absolutely inevitable. And not only that, but the next step is that we should celebrate it because of the vast mystery. If you see this part of it, and I see this part, and wanderer people see that part, Commonwealth people this, America people, New Covenant people, we can enrich one another. If we listen and interact, dialogue, cooperate, then we can get a better picture of what this vast reality that encompasses us is all about. Who we are, how we relate to the one we call our God. So we should celebrate it as enriching our understanding. We should also celebrate it because it keeps us on our toes. You know, it's really good. I mean, one of the reasons I read Crisis magazine is because it challenges a lot of my thinking, and it forces me to rethink what I hold, and it to try to say it in other words. I got to argue with them like I'm reading, and I think, well, how would I refute that? Or how would I try to say it another way? Or how would I come at it? So that other people enrich us. They force us to refine the way we understand the faith and really what it's all about. Now, that's the first point, theological point I want to make. Second point that Ronner makes in a really difficult article, and try to summarize it, it goes something like this: that you have to have opposition in the church. Opposition, as he says, is not merely permitted to a Catholic, but it is required of us. He says you have to, if you're going to be a Catholic, you have to be in opposition. You have to be critical. He starts out by saying to be human is to be critical. To be critical means we think, that we judge, we figure out, what does it mean to me? Whether do I agree with it? Can I live it out? Will it help me or not? So we've got to be critical because we're called upon to make, as he said, a free assent to the faith. And he says that applies not only for individuals, but also for groups. Groups have to be critical within the church. That's part of the function of being a member of the church and belonging to particular groups and so on. Criticism is necessary because whatever the leadership says, it's always inadequate. The leadership, no matter what they try to do or say, are always limited, and whatever they proclaim and put into words, it will always be inadequate. Doesn't matter. It will never totally reflect God and Christ and so on. So that, they can blunder, as he says, make mistakes, be off the track. So we have to be critical of them, of the leadership. What Ronner is getting at here, and he says in other places, is that we got it in the Catholic world. People who grew up like before Vatican II or through that period, that we're sort of off track generally. That we keep thinking that we always need the approbation of the leaders. That we have to have some of the leaders around are going to say, hey, nice work, you did that well, or you're right on track. And he says that's a psychological trap. He says we don't need the bishop's or pope's approval to live as Christians. You know, we don't need somebody's approval to try to go out and try to make the world better or to try to improve parish life. You don't need that. That mandate already comes from the great God and from Christ. And so he says you make a mistake psychologically when you're always waiting for whoever the leadership figure is, the authority figure, to pat you on the back or say, go ahead and do that. Ronner says you've got to move beyond that idea and understand our own individual call. There's always the criticism has to be sort of counter-cultural, counter-church cultural. So we have to try to see if we can to move the church forward into healthy directions. But as he goes through all of this, he says these groups that form should not be like political groups that we know with what he calls party whips. He says that would be the mistake, for the groups to become sort of self-contained and say, we know how this parish is supposed to act and where it's supposed to go, and we really don't care about those other people, and we get together and we plan it and we talk it over and we get it straight, and we got our leaders to keep us on track and make sure that we're towing this official kind of line. I think that when one thinks of groups like Opus Dei, although I know it through people who want to know and reading stuff about it, I don't have any scholarly understanding of it at all. But one gets the impression, at least, that they think of themselves as a party, as a group with the party whips, to keep everyone else in line, to make sure that we have the same ideology here and go out and attack evil world around us, or this church hold out at that 2.